I was thinking about Skynet the other day. Do you remember Skynet from the old Terminator movies? An elaborate network of artificial intelligence-enabled computers that started talking to each other, developed a consciousness, became sentient, and then finally became evil. Then you had that whole story of Arnold Schwarzenegger, coming back from the future, etc. And I started thinking about this very interesting theory, and you may have encountered it, not necessarily through your scholarly engagements, but certainly through meme pages, because I know all of you are on them. This theory that complex systems can develop a consciousness, that artificial intelligence systems can develop a self-awareness, going a little bit beyond this whole idea that they are self-replicating and self-improving. This is very interesting theory. Christoph Koch is one of the scientists who came up with it, and I urge you to go and read some of his work. But what scientists like him have posited is something quite amazing. They've said that if a system is complex enough, for example, the human brain, with billions of synapses firing at each other, and neural networks connecting, and millions and billions of connections sort of raging and talking to each other all the time, that's how the brain develops a soul. That's how it becomes self-conscious. That's how it becomes sentient. And they say that a complex enough system like the internet could do the same thing. And so this theory basically posits, and I understand that it's speculative and there's a lot of assumptions that have gone into it, but the theory fundamentally says that the internet, because of its billions of connections and neurons firing at each other and these little parts of the internet talking to each other all the time, the internet as a thing, without a physical body, without a physical presence, could become sentient, it could become conscious. Or, to put it simply, it could become more than the sum of its parts. And this theory of internet conscious has been, so here's how it basically works. The reason why we're talking about the internet in this sense is because there are, I think, something like 1,000 trillion synapses in the human brain. And the theory posits that's why we became conscious. That's how the brain started thinking for itself. That's how life came to be. That's how we became more than an inanimate object, is because there were 1,000 trillion synapses firing at each other. The internet today is made up of 10 billion computers talking to each other. And if you count all of the transistors within them that are speaking to each other all the time, they're 10,000 times more than the number of synapses in the human brain. And so scientists posit that it's merely a matter of time before the internet becomes sentient and self-aware, and we have artificial intelligence that's fully intelligent. And then there's another scholar called Ray Kurzweil, and you may have heard of the singularity again, if not through your scholarly work, then definitely through the meme pages. Kurzweil posits something called the singularity. The singularity is if enough computers and machines and the internet spoke to each other, humans are going to interact with these machines, and we are going towards what is called this amazing idea that the future is that of a singularity, where machines and humans are one, and this whole universe is sort of bubbling with the same intelligence, the same energy, and we are living in a singularity. Now, I work in the United Nations, in a multilateral system. This is not my field. I'm not here to talk about artificial intelligence, but this theory did get me thinking a little bit about another very complex system, and that is our globalized world. So let's talk a little bit about why this theory of artificial intelligence is so relevant and why it made me think about globalization and this common culture and this common language that as a community of nations we have developed together. At the very outset, I will give you a little caveat. The same scholars who came up with the theory of singularity, of intelligent systems, of the internet developing sentience, said that it's not perfectly replicable to ecosystems of people. Otherwise, say for example, trees in a forest are a complex system. Why haven't they become self-aware? So they say that groups of people are not there yet. But here's the way that I'm going to think about, and that I think about it and where I see the applicability of this might be. Human systems the internet, with its billions of synapses firing at each other, is part of the way that we interact with each other in a globalized world. Today, we are living in a system of countries, communities, nations, and people, a whole generation of migrants talking to each other in thousands and millions of connections around the world every single day on our different apps and the different ways we communicate. Our economies are interacting with each other. There is an unprecedented volume of goods that's flowing between countries, between continents. There's so many different, we send a Snapchat to each other, it disappears. We're not even counting that anymore. So there is such a great volume of interaction between us that we have developed a common language. We've developed a common culture. We're speaking to each other in the same way. There are some very odd things that 10 years ago would not make any sense, but if I was to go in any room of people in any part of the world today and describe a badly animated frog sitting on a unicycle, you would know where that comes from. You know what a classical art meme is. These are weird hieroglyphic languages that we have developed. And so it made me wonder if the globalized world, with its common culture, its many, many different connections, the trillions of ways in which we come together all the time, was going to develop a conscience that was greater than the little parts that constitute it. Are we going to become greater than the sum of our parts? And this is very relevant to my own experience as somebody who works in multilateralism, as somebody who works in the UN, and has to think on a daily basis about the ways in which countries can come together to solve our problems. And for that, I don't think we need to go as far as science fiction. We live in a world today where our challenges are more interconnected than they have ever been. In fact, I would go one step further and say not only are our challenges interconnected, because we as countries are connected, we have challenges today that are exclusively global international challenges. Challenges that don't belong to a country. Let's take the feminist movement, for instance. In the past, there might have been a suffragette movement that raged in a country. It was very directed towards changing the national system, getting women the right to vote in that particular system. Now the feminist movement is global. A hashtag like #MeToo, it takes minutes for it to go from one country to another and cross continents and have a conversation started among billions and billions of men and women about the same thing. We have climate change. Whose responsibility is that? It's not a national problem. Countries, what we in the old-fashioned sense called the developed countries, developed in a certain way that used up resources, was not very resource efficient, and was polluting. Whose responsibility is it to deal with the fallout of climate change? Is it countries that are undertaking development now? Is it our responsibility to then now develop in a way that's not that polluting, to sort of make compromises so that we can save the environment? Is it the responsibility of countries that did develop in a way that was polluting? Should they be buying carbon credits from other parts of the world, etc.? We have wars now that in the olden days, in the Westphalian system, countries went to war against each other. And say, for example, in World War I or World War II, it was possible to be a neutral country. You could be a Switzerland, and if you decided that you had no part to play in the war, you were declared neutral. You could stay out of it. There was no way that war was going to impact you. Today, you could be a South Sudan, and I worked with the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan during their second civil war. The fallout of that affects every single country in the neighborhood. The amount of migration that goes out of a country during a civil war, and refugees that have to seek asylum in safer parts of the world. The fact that we now have terrorist and non-state networks, bound by an ideology, not restricted by boundaries of a country, talking on the internet. The fact that we have weapons of mass destruction. Again, this is not going to be one country's problem if a WMD is used in any part of the world. So now our problems are more interconnected than ever before. But so are our opportunities, as I've already referred to the Me Too movement. The fact that we can now operationalize the responsibility to protect. We can come together and look at our opportunities as a world rather than as separate sets of countries. If there is a war in one part of the world, we have already got a head start on a system like United Nations peacekeeping. We can direct humanitarian interventions collectively. We can mobilize our resources for development. Why do we have today the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? A set of 17 very intuitive ideas we put down on paper. in 2015? Is it because UN bureaucrats were really bored and they wanted another campaign? I don't think it was because of that. It's because the SDGs allowed us to mobilize our collective strength, to mobilize resources, and then to direct efforts as a world to 17 problems that could only be solved through our cooperation. All of these problems, these challenges, these opportunities suggest a very logical progression to becoming, in a strengthened and renewed and resurgent way, more than the sum of our parts. Today, we need a strengthened multilateralism, not based on naivete. I'm not saying that, even in the past when the UN was set up and we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was not motivated by, and it was not an infant John Lennon who came and got people together and said, let's hold hands and sing Imagine. It wasn't some fancy idea that we should all get together. Do you know what the UN was originally in the 1940s? The United Nations was a military coalition of countries that had declared war against fascism. During World War II, United Nations was the label that was given to a set of countries, a military coalition, united against the Nazis. We used the same label when we went into the post-40s world, when these countries wanted to establish a new world order based on liberal values, based on solidarity and cooperation that would eliminate the scourge of war for future generations. They kept the name United Nations. So even back then, multilateralism was something that came from a very logical process, from a very strategic point of view. And today, more than ever, with our interconnected challenges and our problems, multilateralism seems to me a logical next step. But I'd like to return to science fiction for just a minute. There used to be this idea in science fiction, and if you push this too far, this whole theory that we are more than the sum of our parts, that we are an intelligent system made up of intelligent regimes in the same way artificial intelligence is, do we take it as far as singularity, as Ray Kurzweil said? And what does singularity mean for the international system? I mean, if I'm going to adopt a logical process for thinking about multilateralism and a United Nations 2.0, does that mean that we must unite ourselves under a world government? That's always been a bit of a tricky, villainous idea. In a film, there's always, the empire. It's never a positive thing, having an empire, uniting everyone under the same flag, the Sith Empire in the Star Wars. Not a positive thing. All films are oriented around resisting the empire. In fact, our own history of colonialism is about resisting the empire. I don't think that a logical progression going from our interconnected challenges to a strengthened multilateral system and new treaties and new regimes and better dialogue between all of us necessarily leads to world government. And there are flaws to looking at a singularity in the international political sense, because you need the federal viewpoints to be able to maintain that system. In fact, a scholar called Thomas Weiss, who wrote an essay with the title, What Happened to the Idea of World Government, from where I drew the title of my talk, complicates the idea even further. He says that now, because we are so connected, our problems are shared across countries. The fact that at the grassroots we have something like a problem like inequality doesn't belong to a country. In fact, people who are unequal have more in common with each other across countries than they do with people within the same country. That has actually made it more difficult for us to find single government solutions to everything. And therefore, he argues that although we have become more interdependent, it's not a world government that's going to solve any of our problems. However, what we do need is features of that. We need features of world government. We need strengthened international institutions. We already have a head start on some of these. We need what I would like to call a UN 2.0. We need young people talking more to each other on the internet, operationalizing these millions and trillions of synapses that have helped us come closer together, to exploit this generation of migrants who live in two countries at the same time, to come together and come up with solutions, not because of a naive idealism. I'm not urging you to come up with, to adhere to an idea from the past, from the 40s, and take it forward. I'm inviting you to come. I'm not saying that multilateralism as it today stands should be defended. I'm inviting you to come up with ideas for a new multilateralism. In an interconnected world, it should be obvious that we need to do things differently, that we need to operationalize ideas like the responsibility to protect, like peacekeeping, like free trade, like open borders. But how do we do that, given the challenges that we have? It's surprising to me that this is also the time, despite our interconnections, that we have found which is most hostile to multilateralism in a way that it hasn't been before. We've got countries that have disagreed with the Paris Agreement on climate change. We've got Brexit. We've got questions being asked about the UN's role. Even in '94, during the crisis of Rwanda, when the world stood by and a genocide happened, the questions against multilateralism and the UN structures of peacekeeping were not that they were not required. The criticism was that more should have been done, that we should have sent more troops in to protect civilian lives when we had the opportunity and the institutions to do it. How is it today that we stand at the threshold of this unprecedented opportunity to exploit our connections, to exploit our latent singularity, and we are not, rather than operationalizing it, we are raising new questions about multilateralism? I think that's a very important question, and I urge you all to think about it, and I'd like to conclude this by inviting your ideas on what this new multilateralism looks like. What are we going to look like, not as an empire, not as a world government, but as countries united, as people united, and as United Nations in the future. Thank you.